can't procrastinate about this job for any longer. I'm going to have to replace or relay this loose floor tile and a bunch of other loose floor tiles as well. It's a nightmare of a job. I'm going to take you through my kind of train of thought of how I'm going to approach this, and we'll just see how we get on. At the end of the video, you're either going to see a perfectly replaced floor tile, or you're going to see an entire house where every single tile has lifted surrounding this tile. Hiya folks, welcome back. So as I say, I'm relaying this floor tile because it's loose and we're in a new build, and sometimes in new builds you get loose floor tiles. It's nothing to worry about, it's completely normal, but in order to explain why it happens, I need to tell you a little bit about foundations on new build houses, especially in the UK. Now, I'm not an expert in foundation design or anything like that, but this is just my kind of understanding. If I'm talking absolute nonsense, please correct me in the comments. But here is a fairly typical new build house, and generally speaking, in this part of the world, we have very heavy clay soil. The houses are essentially built in farmers' fields, and the foundations are nothing more than a big pit dug down underneath where the walls go. And those are basically strip foundations filled with concrete. So from a top view, this particular house might have foundations that look a bit like that. And there might be extra bits if there's any kind of load-bearing walls in the middle of the house. Then those would have strip foundations as well, and they go quite deep into the soil where the soil is pretty well compacted. It's pretty much as compacted as it's ever gonna get. So once the concrete is poured into that trench, it ain't going anywhere. But then a very common thing they do for the ground floor is what's known as slab on grade, and it's basically concrete poured straight on top of the soil. There's a bit more to it than that. They do put some like aggregate down, and they sometimes reinforce it and insulate it and things like that. But it is essentially concrete poured on top of uncompacted soil. So if I draw it on top of here, it would look something like that. And yeah, this soil will have been compacted a little bit by machines driving over it and the aggregate that's poured on top of it and all of that, but it's nothing compared to how densely packed the soil is once you start digging down a few feet to the depth that the foundations are dug. So when the concrete slab is first poured, if you imagine you've got your soil, you've got your stuff on top of your soil like aggregate and all that sort of stuff, you've got your concrete foundations around the perimeter, and then you've normally got like some bricks and things at the side, and then your concrete kind of gets poured into this gap here and basically fills this space. And then obviously the house gets built like on top of the foundations or whatever. But as this soil here starts to compress and settle, what happens is this whole concrete slab can drop just a little bit. And typically what ends up happening is that it'll normally like crack around the edges where it's no longer supported by the foundations. You can see that really clearly in my workshop where the crack literally follows the perimeter of the room. Basically, this bit here can't go anywhere because it's sitting on top of the foundations, but this bit here does drop a little bit. And I've massively exaggerated the drop here, but if you happen to have tiles that cross over this area where the slab has dropped, then there's really only a couple of options. Either you end up with a gap under the edge of the tile where the slab has dropped, or the tile decides it's not going to separate from the concrete floor and it breaks, and you end up with something like that. You tend to get the tiles breaking when they're very thin, like cuts around doorways and things like that, and with full tiles they're less likely to break and you end up with that gap underneath the tile. Pretty much any house, new or old, that has slab on grade can run into this kind of problem. It's a normal process of the house settling over time. In hindsight, what I probably should have done is waited for a couple of years before having the downstairs tiled, but it worked out more cost effective to get the builders to do it as part of the actual build of the property. So, you know, swings and roundabouts, it's one of those things. This is also a major reason why I generally prefer block and beam rather than slab on grade, because block and beam, effectively your ground floor is suspended by your concrete foundations, so the floor can't go anywhere. And by the way, in older properties, I've had situations, let me just rub this out, where the ground underneath the concrete has settled over time, but the concrete's actually remained suspended on top of the foundations. For example, if you've got another foundation over here, and you've ended up with a void underneath the concrete. And it's really weird when this happens, because it sounds like a hollow floor, but you're looking at it and you know that it's a concrete floor. The only thing to do in that situation is to dig the whole lot up and relay the concrete. Not a fun job. But as I say, generally speaking, nothing to worry about in newer properties. It's just a normal process of the house settling over time. Very common to run into the issue around doorways, because that's going to be the area where you're going to have tiles spanning the concrete foundations and the slab. So in this particular situation, we've got this whole tile here that you can hear it's lost its grip on the concrete floor underneath. We've also got the same problem with these edge tiles here and here, but they're nowhere near as loose as this one. This is actually not bad. This is cracked all the way down the middle because of the drop on this side, basically. And the thing that I'm trying to avoid is for this big middle tile cracking, because at the minute, if you imagine, it's kind of rocking through a centre fulcrum here, and all it takes is for someone to stand here and here at the same time, and you could easily end up breaking that tile, and that's the thing that I'm trying to avoid. I'm not going to lift this one or this one here, because although you can hear they're a little bit loose, it's not where people walk, and getting this tile up and relaying it perfectly aligned with the crack in the tile will be almost impossible. It'll look terrible, so I'd rather just leave those in place. But I think I can relay this one and hopefully avoid it cracking later down the line. I'm just going to use my multi-tool, and I'm using it with a ceramic and stone tile cutter in it, and that should work pretty well for getting the grout out. My main concern is lifting this without breaking it, and lifting it without lifting any of the surrounding tiles. Okay, executive decision here. I have tried and tried to lift this tile and it is not budging. This tile is absolutely solid. I've tried from every angle. I've tried an array of different implements to get it under the tile. I'm going to break this tile if I take it up, and if I break this tile, I cannot get a matching tile, and putting back a tile here with a break all the way down the middle is going to be really noticeable. It's not worth the risk of doing that. Unfortunately, basically the situation is that it's really well adhered down the middle here, but where the floor has dropped at the edge here and here, there's essentially no adhesive underneath it on these two edges. I was going to just give up filming this because there's not a lot to show you, but I thought it would be better to be honest about it and show you the sort of problems that you might run into in the real world. You've got to kind of weigh up the pros and cons of doing a job properly and it looking awful if the tile breaks and creating a whole world of problems, or going for a repair that's not necessarily the repair that you want to do, but there aren't many other options. If you've run into this problem and you've got any better ideas, then please do pop it in the comments below. But what I'm going to attempt to do is get some tile adhesive down this gap, and then I'm going to try and force it under the edge of the tile. And I'll just keep doing that, and I'm trying to push some adhesive under this edge and that edge, and hopefully that'll just offer a bit of support to this edge and it'll stop the tile from cracking, because at the minute there's basically no support under this edge of the tile at all. In the meantime, I've got 3 tiles over by the back door that have the same problem. Let's see if we can get any of those up. So we've got exactly the same problem here. The strip foundation runs basically along here underneath these 2 walls, and the slab on grade, which is in front of it, has slightly dropped, and as a result, over here, you can hear the tiles are completely solid, but here, you can hear that there is essentially nothing under the front of these tiles, and because of that, over time, all the grouts come loose all along here. We've got cracked tiles on the sides here again, just where we've got these little slivers of tiles. Cracked tile over here as well. You can really see on this corner as well how much it's dropped. I mean, it's not a huge amount, probably 3 millimeters or something, but it's certainly noticeable. I don't think I'm going to be able to lift any of these cracked tiles around the edge without breaking them and making it even worse, so I might have to do some sort of creative fillering. But I think I'm going to have exactly the same problem here. It's well adhered, you can hear it's solid along the strip and it's hollow in front of it. So I don't think I'm going to be able to lift these tiles either, and it might have to be the same approach. I'll try and get the grout out along all of the edges and we'll see if we can lift them, but it's not worth the risk of breaking the tiles. So exactly the same problem as on the other tile. It's well adhered along this back edge and there's nothing under it at this front edge. I've tried lifting them. You can feel the tile bending, but it ain't budging at the back there. These tiles aren't going to come up without breaking the tiles. I'll tell you that right now. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make quite a loose tile adhesive mix because I want it to kind of flow under the edge of the tile. So I'm just using NX adhesive here. It's just what Wix happen to have in. It seems to get reasonable reviews. I'm not going to need very much of it. I've already got some water in the bucket. So I would say that's a fairly normal kind of tile adhesive consistency. I'm just going to go a notch looser. I don't want it too loose because if you make it too wet, it'll lose all its strength. But I do want it to try and flow under the edge of the tile. I think that's about perfect. It's got some kind of run to it, but it's not like water, you know. Okie dokie, end of day one, and I think I've managed to get quite a bit of adhesive under the edges of these tiles. I've cleaned it all up. I've used an old paintbrush just to get any adhesive out of the grout lines, because I'm now going to leave this overnight to dry, and then we'll come back tomorrow to grout it. 24 hours later, and sounds good so far. I've mixed up a little batch of grout just from some grout that I had left over from another job. What I've also done is just mixed up a little batch of the grout and let it dry. And this is the dried colour of the grout. Now bear in mind, this is the current colour of the grout, but that's not the colour that it started off being 7 years ago. Here's a little piece of the grout that I pulled out of the joint, and you can see it started off a really light colour, and then 7 years of the floor being washed and people walking on it and all that sort of thing, and eventually it turns to that colour. So what I don't want to do is use a colour matched grout and go straight to that colour, because over time it'll end up looking far too dark. So really what I want is for my grout to be more or less the same colour as the grout when it was new. And then in a very short period of time it'll age and it'll look exactly like what the surrounding grout looks like. And you can also falsely age it by rubbing like oil into it and dirt and, you know, just to simulate 7 years of use basically. And you can get it pretty close to the current colour of the grout. But I don't suggest colour matching to what the grout looks like now. Colour match to what the grout used to look like when it was new. By the way, this is one of these jobs where a customer will say like, oh, how much will it be to like fix a couple of loose tiles? 50 quid or something? It's like, yeah, 3 days later, try 10 times that. I'm just doing my best to feather the new grout into the old grout so that the transition isn't too obvious. And then when I'm wiping the tiles down, generally I try and do a diagonal wipe so as not to pull the new grout out of the joint. So you've just got to be careful with that when you're wiping things down. Right folks, 24 hours later, it's time for the big reveal. You ready? Considering how this started out, I am unbelievably happy with how this has worked out. The tiles now sound completely solid. They're not moving about anymore. They're safe to walk on. The grout has matched up pretty well, really, I think. I'm not going to bore you silly about how I colour matched the grout or how I basically falsely aged the grout, because this video is already stupidly long. I'll also not bore you about how I filled the little bits on the edges. It's not perfect, but it's like a massive improvement on what it was. What I will do, if you want to know about how I aged the grout and how I did the fillering at the sides, I'll shove that on my Patreon, and if you're interested you can go onto my Patreon to watch that. Patreon.com/GosforthHandyman if you want to get any of the extra stuff that I put onto Patreon, job pricing videos, SketchUp videos, stuff like this. I'll also explain on Patreon how much I would charge a customer to do a job like this. Just rest assured that this isn't a quick fix. Could have gone horribly wrong. I'm so pleased that I didn't try to lift these tiles. I think that would have been a very bad idea. If you remember the tile in the hallway, it was just an absolute disaster zone. The tile was loose, all the grout had cracked out, you couldn't walk on it without it feeling like the tile was going to break. And here it is now, completely solid. The grout's all matched in. And here around the back door, all 3 of these tiles were loose. All the grout was loose. And now here it is, all completely done and dusted. This'll literally last a lifetime now, because the house isn't going to settle any more than it's already settled. If you would have tackled this job in a different way, post down in the comments below. It's always interesting to get different people's takes on how they would do different stuff, and also how you would do it in different parts of the world as well. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this. Job's a good one. Don't forget, I'm now putting some gaming content out on my Andy Mac Drums channel, mostly Farming Simulator 19 at the minute. If that floats your boat, then please do subscribe to Andy Mac Drums, link in the description below. For now, take care folks, tatty bye!